My name's Marissa Bennett. You may see, you're in the Facebook world, you'll see me furiously posting things. But I just wanted to welcome you guys all here. Welcome everybody for showing up. It's a big group. This is great. And tell you a little bit about how this happened for a couple reasons. We watched a movie at the Alma Draft House called She's Beautiful When She's Angry. And one thing that kind of floated from out of the top of that conversation was that this book, Our Bodies Ourselves, which was a total game changer for a lot of women, it was crowdsourced. So it was just people asking questions, and then they went and found the answers to those questions. And for me, that was just a huge relief, and it made me realize that grassroots, it's from the bottom. So all of us can do it. And so really it's just about getting those questions, throwing them to the group, and then seeing who's got the resources and like, oh hey, I know somebody who has the answer, or I know somebody else. So I just want to share that story because of that, we found out that a lot of us didn't really know that much about how the Texas government works, the details. I mean, 7th grade was a long time ago, right? And so that was one of the questions that came out of it. From there, we throw that to the group, and then Rue Wood, who's a teacher at Northwest Vista, says, I know somebody who would be able to give a class on that. So I'm just sharing that to say that, that absolutely, this movement is everybody's movement. So it's not about whether you went to Women's March or Indivisible or whatever your affinity group is, right on, wherever you feel comfy. But the cool thing is, and the thing that I'm hoping that we all become aware of, is that literally all it takes is a question. It's just a question. And then you just throw the ball in the air and the group will catch it, and then things like this happen. So I just wanted to share that, and I wanted to really thank Rue, and I want to thank Deborah, which I'll let Rue introduce Deborah. She'll do a better job than me, and encourage everybody to ask lots of questions, because this is for us, right? So anyways, thank you so much, and now Rue Wood will.
Thank you, Marissa. And you guys ought to really give yourself a hand for coming out tonight on a Thursday night. You guys are awesome. All right. One of the things that the Women's March, part of the mission statement is to educate, and it's to educate people about being more involved in their political systems and their governance. So with that in mind, when we started thinking about that, I said, I know someone. And so I'm really proud to introduce our speaker for the evening, and this is Assistant Professor at Northwest Vista College, Assistant Professor of Government, Deborah Cardona, and she's an ex-colleague of mine and a friend, and I'm just going to hand it over to Deborah. So.
All right, so thanks for having me. It's an honor to be here. Y'all are doing some really great work. And so I hope that whatever information I impart will at least give you the tools to develop a more effective strategy. Because I tried to follow along online. You all were posting questions that you wanted me to address. And one of the things that I came away with were mostly admissions of guilt and shame and embarrassment of not knowing how Texas government works. And so first, let me just put your mind at ease. No one knows how the hell Texas government works. Nobody. There's a reason for that. There are many variables that play a role, but we basically have a political culture that is highly individualistic. We are so focused on ourselves. Mm-hmm. Then we have a structure of government that maintains the status quo. And part of that status quo is an incredibly small government. So being so focused on ourselves, having an incredibly small government, and also not having competitive elections, the fact that we are a one-party state with just Republican dominance, all of that depresses voter participation, voter knowledge. It doesn't inspire folks to get on out there and be proactive. And so those are some of the structural obstacles to being an agent of change politically. But socially, there are additional obstacles that you'll need to contend with. You know, I tell my students all the time that the Democratic Party has this campaign, it's called Turning Texas Blue. And so they go and they look at the numbers and they see all this population data with the increase in Hispanic voters who are far more likely to vote Democratic. And while that is true, what they don't recognize is that some of the structural barriers that exist within that fastest growing population is that they are a lot younger, they have lower levels of education, and of course that happens to be correlated with income. Those three variables are the biggest predictors of someone going out and voting. And so, you know, this idea of turning Texas blue by 2020, I'm sorry, not going to happen. But for me, my emphasis, one of the areas of my specialization is on institutions. I focus on how they work, right? And so if you know how the institutions work, you know what those rules are, you know that those rules shape certain outcomes. And so that is basically what I want to share with you guys tonight. I want to focus on what those rules are so that you can see what the effects are, right? Knowing what the outcomes are will help you develop a strategy to be more effective and more strategic, right? No one wants to waste their time, you know, pounding doors or pounding the pavement. You know, being more strategic is about maximizing time, and so hopefully this is going to allow you to do that, okay? All right, so mind you, I prepared a very brief overview of how Texas works. You know, it usually takes me about 16 weeks to teach, but I got it summed up in about 30 minutes, so let's see how we do. All right. So the first thing I would like for you to do is take a look at this poster, if you will. Poster number 1 is basically a triangle, okay? And so you'll note that the triangle appears everywhere. That triangle is what is referred to as basic organization theory. All organizations, whether public or private, are typically organized in this way. And so what that triangle does, you have someone at the top and underlings, right? It's basically a hierarchy, a chain of command, right? That's why I know, for example, if I have a student who wants to go and complain about me, well, they can come and complain to me directly, but if they're not satisfied with my response, what are they going to ask for? A supervisor, who also has a supervisor, who also has a supervisor until you get to the top, right? And so this is basic organization theory, and so we see it again in both public and private organizations. And so we find this pattern emerging and re-emerging and re-emerging. Now, the one thing to keep in mind, however, in Texas, we like to think of ourselves as special. And so that will be reflected in our hierarchy as well, okay? All right, so looking at poster number 1, the first thing I did was basically create a diagram of government within the United States, right? We have a hierarchy of government. We have Article 6 of the U.S. Constitution that dictates that U.S. laws and signed foreign treaties are the supreme law of the land. So anytime there's a contradiction, then U.S. laws trump state laws, and no pun intended. But we also have the 10th Amendment. And even though the 10th Amendment is incredibly, incredibly vague, it really says nothing, it's still something that states have to push back against far-reaching government, okay? So if you'll notice at the top part of that diagram, we have the arrows with power flowing both ways, right? But our emphasis tonight is on the lower half. We want to look at Texas and its relationship with local governments and how each of those levels of governments are organized and how they work. So the first thing that I hope you recognize here, we only have arrows in one direction on the lower half, right? So you were just talking about grassroots. In Texas, power flows from the top down, okay? And so that means that local governments do not have a 10th Amendment of any kind to push back against an encroaching state government, okay? So that's going to be key to understanding and appreciating this relation between the state and local governments, okay? Now, the confusion that most of us have concerning, and I include myself in this, totally include myself in this. The confusion that we have is rooted in the fact that there is so much overlap in government. Nationally, we have over 89,000 local governments. In Texas, we have 254 counties. That means 254 county governments. There are over 1,200 municipalities. There are over 2,600 special districts, and there are over 1,000 independent school districts. All of those have jurisdictions that overlap. And so the best way to find out which governments you fall under is to look at your property tax bill. It'll give you a complete list of all of the governments that have jurisdiction over you, right? So of course you have the federal government, state of Texas, Bexar County, San Antonio. Some of the special districts that you reside in include the Alamo Community Colleges District. We have CPS and SAWS, and someone asked about the San Antonio River Authority. There are a host of special districts. And the thing is that most of those special districts basically fall under the radar, okay? So power is concentrated at the state level when we're looking at the relationship between the state and local governments, okay? All right, so I guess, let me ask first if there are any questions. Is that dynamic clear?
Why is there no Amendment 10? The lower line.
Because at the national level, the U.S. Constitution ratified the 10th Amendment after the fact, but when the Constitution was initially ratified, there wasn't this need to include it, right? Because states held all of the power under the Articles of Confederation. But in the negotiation process for ratification, that was one of the demands that anti-federalists made. So the federalist system that we have is based on shared power between the national and state governments. That is the political system that organizes the different levels of government between the national and states. Each of the individual state units have a different organizational structure. It's based on a unitary system where power is concentrated at the state level. So that means that it's very easy for them to make laws, and they get no pushback, right, from any of the local governments. The key to understanding that relationship is the local governments exist because the state allows them to exist. And if the state wants to go and alter, amend, consolidate, abolish those local governments in any way, they can. It's not unheard of. It happened in the 90s in Massachusetts. They abolished a corrupt county, right? And so it's not unheard of. There are no powers for local or state governments.
So this is not unique to Texas?
This is not unique. In fact, most states are organized using that political model, the unitary system, so they concentrate power at the state level.
Is that why, for instance, Abbott, the governor just said to our police force, you are going to take these DPS people, okay, and the local police chief said, okay. Is that an
That
example?
is exactly right.
Oh, okay.
That is
makes
exactly
sense.
right.
I was
Okay?
wondering why.
Yeah.
Okay.
All right, so we've got federalism versus Unitarianism, right? Now, on the second poster, now here this is truly, sixth grade refresher, reminding you of the institutions of government. And here I'm basically using the federal government as a model for comparative purposes. When we look at how the federal government is organized, most people, even if you don't pay attention to politics, most people know how the federal government is organized and how it works to some degree. And so we're using that as a model because state and local governments also incorporate various elements of that, okay? And so in the first diagram, we have an example of the presidency. And I think it's an example of the presidency. What are we looking at? Yes. All right, so we're looking at the executive branch here. And so if you'll notice, that the triangle makes a comeback here. That triangle, you have what an executive based on a singular executive, right? One person at the top. If there are any complaints within the federal system of government, we know who to blame, right? Where does the buck stop? At the top. And so that is key, right? Understanding that when there is some sort of fault or praise that should be assigned, it's typically delegated to that person at the top. One of the other organizational features of the executive branch is that the president is able to select who serves in their cabinet. They get to hire and fire those individuals, okay? This is really key because those people serve at the pleasure of the president. If the president has a specific policy agenda and you get some maverick, say an attorney general that decides to oppose the president publicly, well, that attorney general didn't get elected, the president did. And so that president can demand their resignation and find someone who will help them implement their agenda. And so in Texas, again, I did say we were special. We take the lower half of that triangle. But instead of creating a singular executive, we have a model based on a plural executive. So unlike the president, who is independently elected and gets to go and make appointments, in Texas, the governor has no cabinet. In fact, the traditional cabinet that the governor should have actually is also independently elected. They are elected in a statewide election just like the governor. So I have a list of all of those independently elected executives that comprise the plural executive. And so here you can, right off the bat, you can see the dynamic. Let's say you get that maverick attorney general coming out and speaking out against the governor. What recourse does the governor have in dealing with that attorney general in Texas? None. It becomes purely political, a battle of personalities. And so there typically is no recourse. They each have their own independent sources of power. Okay?
And that again is a matter of how the state writes their own charter? In other words, it's unique to each state, as it were.
Yes, every state gets to draft their own constitution, right? We have
Gotcha.
dual constitutionalism. And so given our historical experience in the aftermath of the Civil War, and in particular one governor that had a tremendously negative impact, what the framers were trying to do was dilute the power of the governor. And so we see that particularly with respect to those appointments, right? Remember that the executive branch is not just the governor, it is all of the bureaucracy, it is all of the people underneath that go and help the executive branch implement all of the laws that get passed by the legislature, okay? And so we have an extraordinarily weak governor. Most Texans don't know that. Because despite the fact that they are weak, they are still the spokesperson for the state, right? If you're the media and you have, the lieutenant governor versus the governor, who do you record and who do you air? Well, most people don't know who the lieutenant governor is at any given time. Dan Patrick. Rush Limbaugh. Excuse me, Rush Limbaugh. Houston. Yeah. So we don't know who these people are, but, you know, even if you live under a rock, most people know who the governor is. And so that is why they are able to command the attention. And that's why we make assumptions that their constitutional powers are equivalent to the president, and that's not the case. Now, Rick Perry was really successful at consolidating power, but then again, you know, he served for 14 years. If you can't consolidate power in 14 years, you have a problem, right? But otherwise, we have a very diluted appointive power for the governor. But on top of that, even where the governor should traditionally have strength, which is in the legislative arena, right? The executive branch is always expected to lead the legislature. They're expected to introduce legislation and to set the agenda. So even in many respects, part of the power that the governor is able to exert in implementing their agenda is largely determined on the individual political skill of the governor. And this particular governor, how do you think he's doing so far? Right, I mean, compared to Rick Perry, who was, you know, compared to Rick Perry, who was able to get things done, this governor, not as effective, not as effective. I mean, it may be a learning curve in your first year, but he has not been particularly effective. But, as you know, Joe Strauss, who was the moderate, and by moderate I use that term very loosely, right? He's pro-business, but in terms of many of the social policies that were attempted this last session, he single-handedly, and I do mean literally single-handedly, killed, for example, that bathroom bill, and so forth. So, so we've got a weak governor, and this particular governor not as effective. Let's see here. When it comes, yeah, go ahead.
What power do these other folks have? I know the lieutenant governor and the governor, these other folks have any power at all?
The agricultural commissioner oversees agriculture. That's Sid Miller.
Yeah.
Crazy kook. He really is. I mean, he is the guy who, you know, considering Texas, you know, when you look at the rankings of how Texas fares in different social policies, Texas ranks in the top 10 of all of the worst categories and in the bottom 10 of all of the best categories. And in fact, I was just showing a few people, and my classes included, go to the website. Gosh, who was it? The Controller of Public Accounts?
You can just
I will pass along the information. But I want to say it's the Controller of Public Accounts. Anyway, he took those rankings. For example, Texas being #1 in uninsured, and flipped them. Literally flipped them. So he has this ranking where Texas, when it comes to the uninsured rate, instead of being first and uninsured, we're listed as 50th.
And you posted that?
It is on a government website, and I'll find which one it is, but it is one of the executive. So anyway, the agricultural commissioner, they oversee agriculture, and they actually are kind of important. They also oversee the scales, all scales. You know, if you go and buy a pound of ground beef at H-E-B, that scale that measures is reviewed and inspected and so forth. If you think that you're getting less gas than what you are paying for, that is a scale. And so if you start paying attention next time you go put gas in, there's a sticker somewhere on the gas pump that'll tell you who to contact.
And did he try to change the school lunch menus yet?
He did, and
Eat more beef.
Coke and candy machines have made a comeback, despite, you know, being ranked 8th in obesity in Texas. So, yeah. So that's the agricultural department. The general land commissioner, when Texas became a state, we were able to maintain our public lands. And so that general land commissioner basically oversees those public lands, rents those public lands, leases them out to businesses to mine for whatever minerals and so forth. But they also oversee a veterans program, so that's something else that's important. The controller of public accounts, that's basically the state's tax collector. Their primary responsibility is to certify the amount of funds that Texas has to spend in each budgetary cycle. And in fact, that certification by the Controller of Public Accounts is so important that the Constitution stipulates that if the legislature wants to spend more money than is certified, it must do so with a 3/4 supermajority vote. Now, you know Republicans can't even repeal Obamacare with 51, so 3/4 never going to happen, right? Let's see here. The Attorney General, their primary responsibility, they serve as the lawyer for the state. They also oversee the state's child support payments. And they also issue opinions, advisory opinions. Anytime there is a law that might get challenged in the courts as unconstitutional, then typically, and I say typically because this legislature led by Dan Patrick is incredibly radical, they typically will ask the Attorney General for an opinion. They're basically saying, yeah, go ahead and pass this. You know, we're not going to, it's going to be upheld by the courts, or don't pass it, it's likely to be overturned, okay? And so that's the primary responsibility of the Attorney General. The Lieutenant Governor has the typical responsibilities as the Vice President in that they serve as President of the Senate. But you know that the Vice President, what power do they have as President of the Senate?
Tiebreakers.
Tiebreaker. Literally, that is it. And that is not the case in Texas, okay? That is not the case in Texas, and so that brings us over here. So here we're looking at the legislature. And again, we're looking at the legislature comparing the federal model, that's our reference point, and then comparing that to Texas. So the first thing that you should be aware of is that things happen very, very differently in Congress than they do in Texas. In Congress, there are a ton of power players, right? This is how we can get someone like John McCain going and speaking out against the leadership. That kind of thing does not happen in Texas. In Texas, we have a bicameral legislature. It meets once every other year in odd-numbered years. So this last session ended in June. It meets once every other year for no more than 140 days. Okay? So recall that I stipulated that institutions shape outcomes. And so if we have a legislature, we have right now we have the 13th largest economy in the world. In the world. All by ourselves, we have the 13th largest economy in the world. And yet we have a legislature that meets for 3 months every other year. How do you think we are governing? How effective can we be? How do we deal with problems as they arise if we're only there for 140 days? So there are some major, major consequences. So first off, let me tell you the good points of the Texas legislature, okay? It's easy to know where the power players are. They're right at the top. Okay? They're right at the top, the presiding officers. In the Texas House of Representatives, that's your Speaker of the House. In the Senate, who is the presiding officer? The Lieutenant Governor. Okay? Now the Constitution does not give or assign powers other than, to the lieutenant governor, other than presiding over the Senate. But because of the procedural rules, thank you. The procedural rules are where, that's the power source, how legislation gets done, what the legislative process is about. That is where, or how rather, the lieutenant governor obtains their power. So one of the things that you need to be aware of when dealing with the state legislature is that absolutely nothing, and I mean nothing, gets through our state legislature without the consent of those two presiding officers. So you need to know who they are and where they stand politically, right? In this last legislative session, this was a special, maybe I need to use a different word. This was a unique session in the sense that we saw a very, very contentious and public conflict emerge between the Speaker of the House and the Lieutenant Governor. That rarely happens. They typically work in unison. They have a unified agenda going forward. They have an agenda that they want to get done, and by golly, they get it done. But this particular legislative session, one of the things that we saw come to the forefront is part of what we see going on with Republicans everywhere. Republicans are in the midst of party change, and so you basically have factions within the Republican Party. They're competing for the future of the party. And one faction is the establishment. The guys that are in office who know that in order to stay in office, you need a compromise in order to get things done. They are lovingly referred to as rhinos, right? Republicans in name only. They are often criticized by the other faction, the Tea Party, right? They're criticized for not having principles, for not being true conservatives. But the thing about this particular lieutenant governor, though, is that he represents yet another faction that historically has existed within the Republican Party, and that is the faction between fiscal conservatives and religious conservatives. Okay, so aside from Dan Patrick being, incredibly extremist in his rhetoric and political philosophy, he's also he's part of the religious faction within the Republican Party. Joe Strauss, part of the fiscal conservatives, right? Pro-business. And so that bathroom bill, for example, that got killed, again, that public display of tension between the two is why it didn't pass. But believe me, if Joe Strauss were in favor of that bathroom bill, that would have been signed, sealed, and delivered. Okay, so it was his fiscal conservatism, because in order to get reelected, you need money, and particularly in Texas, we spend a boatload of money on statewide elections. We've got all these interest groups, particularly businesses, contributing to PACs and so forth, and so they get an earful, and that's who he was listening to. He was listening to those constituents. Okay. All right. Now, those presiding officers, some of the procedural powers that they have. Well, first off, let me just highlight a couple of things. So here we have an example. This triangle is an example of the leadership hierarchy that exists in the Texas legislature. And so we've got the presiding officers at the top, followed by committee chairs and backbenchers. Backbenchers are basically anyone who is not in a leadership position but is a member of the legislature. It's very straightforward. In the Texas legislature, there is no challenge to the power of the presiding officers. It is incredibly rare for a presiding officer, and in this particular case I'm speaking specifically about the Speaker of the House, it's very rare that they get challenged. Because when it comes to the selection of the lieutenant governor, we know they get elected in a statewide election. The voters pick them. But the speaker, they have a dual selection process. They must first get elected as a member of the House of Representatives, and then they throw their hat in the ring for the speakership. And that is where it becomes incredibly political. In the mid-70s, we had all these scandals, and part of the scandals called for increased transparency in government. So state responded by making the selection of the speaker transparent. So before, members of the House would vote by secret ballot. Now it is a matter of public record. And so, you know, human behavior plays a role here. You know, if you're running for the speakership and you go and you're working the room and you're trying to get members to vote for you, you know, you're going to try to get as many commitments as possible. And when people go back on their word, you know, that has consequences. And those consequences are typically seen based on the procedural powers of those presiding officers, okay? So next in the leadership hierarchy are the committee chairs. They don't pose a threat to the speakers or the presiding officers because they're appointed by the presiding officers. So anytime power is given to you, it can be taken away. And that is why the powers of the presiding officers are.
So it's not seniority
So-
on the committee?
We do not have seniority in Texas. You do in Congress, it does not work in Texas. And so this is why I go back to the selection of the speaker, just to highlight how political this process is. So first off, again, it's a matter of public record. You know, if you said you were going to do one thing and you turn around and did something else, believe it or not, trust actually is a major, plays a major role in politics, right? This is why Trump isn't getting, you know, isn't as effective as he thought he was going to be, right? Despite having unified government, he doesn't have friendships and loyalties within that government. And so trust is huge. It's capital. And so if you, the key, if you're a member, when you're voting for the speaker, the key is to know how to vote. And that would be voting the right way.
For the winner.
Exactly. Because again, going back to human behavior, if you know you get someone who votes against you, you know your feelings are probably going to get hurt. And our legislators are no different, especially when they're able to exercise power. So when we look at those procedural powers, one of the first major powers that the presiding officers have is that they determine the composition of every single committee. Think about that for a second. They determine the entire composition of every single committee. So they know who they're working with. They get to establish committees that have ideological tilts, and so they know exactly who sits on every single committee. They also determine who the chairs of every single committee are. Okay? So that's first. The composition of every committee and its chairs are entirely determined by the presiding officers. Now, at the start of each legislative session, every legislator will go and have a list of preferences, right? Committee preferences. But if you're one of those legislators who voted the wrong way, oh, God help you. You get taught a lesson in that very first cycle. You get taught a very powerful lesson because you get sent to legislative oblivion. Okay? All right. Now, speaking of that committee structure, I wanted to highlight one of the consequences that we see of a biannual legislative session. Okay? So, for example, in Congress, we have a full-time legislature. That full-time legislature means that those legislators are there year in and year out. They serve on very specific committees. It creates a political class, right? This is why we have the career politicians. But they're there year in and year out, serving on very particular committees, which means that over time, they get to develop policy expertise, right? So the committee structure within the legislature, that's actually very much like a Ford assembly line, right? If you're, working on cars and your role is to put the tires on, well, you may not be very good on your first day. But by the end of the year, you can probably put those tires on with your, hands tied behind your back, and you do it with your toes, and blindfold or whatnot. And so that is really what's key. Now think about that. That is the goal of the committee system, right? Divide the labor and maximize expertise. But in Texas, if you have a legislature that meets for 140 days every other year, what kind of experts are they? Would you want a doctor who only went to school every other spring semester? I know I wouldn't, right? If they need to amputate a foot, if it's a left foot, they're going to do the right, and oh, they didn't mark it, right? Take out the wrong word. This is the biggest problem. So if they are not policy experts, then they have to rely on policy experts. And in Texas, no one pays attention to voting. We're ranked 51st, even after Puerto Rico. So who is left to fill that vacuum? Lobbyists. Lobbyists who in Texas actually work in conjunction with and coordinate with the administration, with the executive branch, okay? So, for example, one of the questions that I got online was, what does the Texas Railroad Commission do? Well, in Texas, we believe in small government. In the early 1900s, we were no longer constructing railroads, but rather than create a brand spanking new agency, we basically had just discovered oil, so we gave the Texas Railroad Commission the task of overseeing and regulating the oil industry. So that is what the Texas Railroad Commission does. They oversee the Railroad Commission. And so that Railroad Commission, if you take a look at all of the commissioners, guess where every single one of them come from?
Texas A&M. Oh, sorry.
Which is the hub of
The oil and
the energy industry, right? And so there is often this coordination between the public sector, right, the state agency, and the private sector, the interest group, or whatever interest is being represented. And so if that is the only information or expertise that you are receiving, do you think that the oil industry is going to tell you about all of the negatives of fracking, for example? Of course not. They're only going to spin the positives about job creation. And so this is one of the major consequences, is that our legislators, they don't have the opportunity to develop policy expertise, so they rely on the expertise of others, okay? One of the other things that you should also be aware of is this idea of a part-time legislature, and so this is the positive spin. So this is my one positive for the moment. And the positive of the part-time legislature is that it's designed to create a citizen legislature. It's the idea, it's the idea of having the regular Joe go and make policies that reflect the will of the people. And so you go for a very short period of time, and then when you're done, you get to go back and live your life, okay? And so that in and of itself is problematic, because a lot of our legislators, they go back to their regular jobs, and most of them are lawyers. And who else happens to be lawyers, mostly? Or at least work in a law firm? Lobbyists. And so, Austin is very, very small. So are these legal circles. I like to use the example of academia. You know, when I went to grad school, I went to a couple of grad schools, and so I have friends teaching at different institutions throughout the state. The same is true with the legal system, right? Everyone goes to the same few law schools, and so when it comes to lobbyists, when it comes to the legislators, you know, they only earn $7,200 a year. And so they are reliant on that other job. And law firms are quick to pick up on, to pick up those legislators, right? It's a matter of prestige, right? It's a law firm being able to say, hey, to new clients, right? You know, so-and-so, representative or Senator so-and-so, you know, works for us. And so that's something to keep in mind, is that the citizen legislature, it sounds great in theory, but in practical terms, there are significant consequences, and that consequence is the lack of expertise. Okay?
How much did he say they earn?
$7,200 a year. But don't worry, they're going to be fine. Their retirement is set on judicial salaries, which are over $150,000. So that's, and they also get a per diem. So in total, for the year, including the per diem, they earn about $28,000, $29,000 a year. And that includes the lieutenant governor and speaker of the House, by the way. So money matters.
Okay. I read something recently where now, since they only meet every other year at the legislature, someone called, I don't know who, called for studying for the next legislature. And they said, I don't know, was it the governor set 2 agenda items or something like that?
This is part of the procedural powers of the presiding officers.
Okay.
So that would be the Texas Legislative Council. That council is basically, it's like a committee with staffers that go and conduct research. They also provide assistance in drafting bills and so forth. But the members of that committee include the 2 presiding officers, and every other member on that committee, just like all of the other committees, are appointed by the presiding officers. And so the presiding officers get to dictate what policies get researched, which bills get assistance with drafting, and what doesn't. Okay, so yeah, that's part of those procedural powers. Yes.
Yeah, I have some minimal experience in Hawaii politics. And the legislature met every other year for 60 days. And the result was that the committees were all powerful because the general sessions were like an auction. The bill comes up, next
Right.
bill, that would go on
Right.
for 60 days.
Right.
So the committee chairs would actually write things and be pretty confident that there would never be an amendment to it. Is there something like that in Texas?
Sort of. Okay, but this point actually brings us back to that power of the presiding officers in determining the entire composition of every single committee. Okay, so you know, actually, here I went ahead and printed the committees that currently exist. These are the permanent committees in the Texas House of Representatives. Okay, so I'm going to pass this around and take a look at the list. And you know, my boyfriend comes from Colorado, and he was asking, can I ask about legalization? Well, let's say that there is a bill to legalize marijuana in Texas. Now,
She said, don't ask the question, don't do it.
take a look at this list and see if you could figure out what committee would be responsible for that particular bill. Okay? So that brings me to a second procedural power of the presiding officers they refer all bills that get introduced, okay? And what that means is they get to pick which committee a bill goes to. Now think about that in strategic terms. If you're the presiding officer, as Joe Strauss was, who was in opposition to that bathroom bill, he determined not just the composition, but he is well informed about the ideological composition of every single committee. So when they make that initial referral, they get to send the bill to the committee and basically determine its outcome, okay? Now, every committee, once the committee is assigned a bill, there are hearings and investigations and expert testimony and so forth, and changes are always made to those bills, okay? But when it comes to those committees, just to highlight how important that referral is, you know, in Congress, bills die at that initial committee stage at a rate of about 75%. In Texas, that rate is over 90%. That is basically a cemetery for every bill that gets introduced. Why? Because those presiding officers know exactly which committees will be favorable or opposed to any given piece of legislation. The good news is a bill still, you know, might make it out of the committee. Highly unlikely, but it could happen. I want to try to be positive here. But even if it did, let's say that a bill was opposed by one presiding officer and still made its way through that entire chamber. Remember, historically, the two presiding officers act in unison. They have a unified agenda. So the other presiding officer is likely to also oppose that bill, and so it'll also go through the same rigor in terms of the referral process, referring that bill to a committee that would not be favorable or favorable, whatever the case might be. Okay, so that's another power. Okay. I saw another hand up a little bit ago. Did I lose you or? Okay. All right. So you know, there are other powers that matter here. One in particular is that at the very start of every legislative session, every session has rules. They create, each chamber has their own set of rules of how the legislative session will operate. And the arbiter or interpreter of those rules is
Presiding officer.
the presiding officers.
Oh,
One area.
Popovich for lieutenant governor.
He has been so outspoken that. Go ahead.
Curry and Kerr with Golden State
Yeah.
said that they would vote for him for president. They're playing him tonight. They're going against him.
I think I'm in Texas.
He has been so outspoken and so eloquent on this issue. But you know, when we look at those rules, for example, and how significant they are, was anyone there for the Wendy Davis filibuster that night?
I have to watch it.
No, I mean in
There.
Austin at the Capitol.
No.
Okay, so I was teaching that summer session, and I had some students that wanted to go, and so I just said, what the hell, let's go. And so we went, and that was a special session. And so she started her filibuster at about 11 o'clock in the morning. You know, she made those tennis shoes famous and, you know, whatnot. So about 5 minutes into the filibuster, a fellow senator walks up behind her and puts on a back brace. Now, here's what you need to know in terms of how this applies. The rules in the Senate concerning the filibuster, you have a few basic rules. One, if you're going to start a filibuster, you stand. No leaning, no sitting, I mean, not even that, right? You stand. 2, the floor is yours. The moment you leave the floor, your filibuster is over. So it's not like in Congress where, you'll get some senator go and, crackpot reading green eggs and ham. Yeah, we don't do that in Texas. We are hardcore. You start a filibuster, you stay with a filibuster. There are no breaks, no potty breaks, no food, nothing. Ted Cruz.
I saw that in my group.
The other thing is, during a filibuster in Congress, you can go off on some tangents. Not so in Texas. Every word that you speak must be germane to whatever bill you are filibustering. Okay? And 4, 3 strikes and your filibuster is over. So Wendy Davis begins her filibuster. She is standing, she is ready, she's got all of these law books and data, she's ready to go. And someone walks up behind her and puts that back brace. So right off the bat, there is a point of order. There is a Republican senator who asks, "Excuse me, is that a lien?" Well, what were they filibustering? Do y'all remember?
It was the abortion.
Yeah.
Yes, it was a regulation of the abortion clinics, right? Increasing the standards of those equipment so that they resemble
Basically,
hospitals
yeah.
rather than a doctor's office. And so that was a bill that was being pushed by Republicans. It was the last day of the session. She starts at about 11:30. She gets that back brace on within 5 minutes. We've got that first point of order. So who is responsible for determining, is that a lien? Let me see, I'm a Republican and I favor this bill, so how do you think that got interpreted? Strike one, right? Strike one. And so that is yet another power of the presiding officers. So they're able to both directly and indirectly shape absolutely everything that comes out of the legislature.
So how did the story end?
At about 11:30, she had her third strike, and
12 hours later?
yeah, it was almost 12 hours. It was about 11 and a half hours, and Republicans were hustling in the last 30 minutes. They were trying to get that bill through because that special session was ending at midnight, at exactly midnight. And so they started rushing, and so the people that were in, the people that were in the gallery, see, they were passing along messages. And so as they passed along the message was, shit, Republicans are still trying to get this, they're trying to ram this through. And so everybody started chanting that night. And if you've ever been into the Texas legislature, every single square inch was full. I mean, me and my students were just drenched in sweat because it was jam-packed. And so we made so much noise that Republicans could not hear themselves talk, and that bill was killed. Now, there was another special session, that's when it got passed, but, people's voices were heard that time, okay?
So for influencing, you should really be going to presiding officers and knowing your committees, maybe.
You definitely want to know your committees, okay? So if you're trying to affect change, protests aren't going to do it. They'll get you some attention, but they are highly unlikely to affect change. You'll need, a multi-pronged approach. One way to start is to start with voters. We are all subjected to peer pressure. And so when you start voting within your circle and get others to start voting, that spreads, okay? But our legislators, for the most part, even if they're not interested in being a career politician, they might have other political aspirations, right? So there is a heavy dependence on getting reelected. And so one approach would be to use representatives' constituents directly. Use their voters to contact them, right? It does no good for you to go and contact, I'm drawing a blank on the entire legislature apparently right now, but it doesn't do any good to go and contact a representative from a district in Dallas if you live in San Antonio, right? So you need to be as far-reaching as possible and really concerted with your effort to contact your representative, but have constituents of other representatives contact them.
You know, by like email? To like just go ahead and email the...
Anything and everything, okay? I had a student, last week I went and bought some groceries, and when I got to the cashier at HEB, she starts telling me, you know, I had you for class several semesters ago. I don't remember this person. But I said, hi, how you doing? And she said, you know, coming into my class, that she had never paid attention to politics. But I always required that students contact a representative. I didn't care what the issue was, I never did. But they had to find some policy problem, identify which government had jurisdiction over that problem, and write them an old school letter. She told me that the letter that she wrote was about the speed of vehicles by Warren High School. So she wrote her city council member asking for speed bumps. And according to the Texas Constitution, when you formally make your grievance known, that grievance must be acknowledged. So she actually did not get a response. She got no email back. You know, if you ever write Ted Cruz or John Cornyn, they'll always give you an email. That's because the Texas Constitution says they need to acknowledge. Not give you what you want, but acknowledge. And so she said that she never got an email, but that literally a few weeks later, those speed bumps appeared.
Wow.
I cannot tell you the power of having a voter go and voice those concerns.
Uber and Lyft.
Huh?
Uber and Lyft.
Uber and Lyft.
I'll get to that in a second. So voters, incredibly important, should be part of the strategy, okay? The other part of the strategy is, you know, when we look at the system of government, right, we've got a national government, we have 50 states, over 89,000, you know, local governments in Texas. You know, we're ranked third in terms of the highest number of local governments. We have over 5,000. And so, while it creates confusion because there's overlap in jurisdiction, the fact that there are so many governments is actually a good thing. Because what it does for anyone trying to affect change, it provides multiple access points, right? So let's say you try to get something done at the state level and it doesn't work. Well, that's fine. You take it down to the local level and you start with cities, right? For example, the recent texting bans, that was actually a public interest group that attempted to get that texting ban passed back in 2006, right? And back in 2006, no one knew the dangers of texting while driving, and so the members of Congress literally laughed in their faces. So they went back, re-strategized, they regrouped, and they, instead of going big, they went and took a two-pronged approach by going to local governments and to state governments. And so, for example, in Texas, we had Corpus Christi and Houston and Austin and Dallas and even now San Antonio pass an ordinance prohibiting texting while driving. In 2011, they were effective in getting the bill passed at the state level. But Rick Perry was opposed, so he vetoed that legislation. But as you know, it just got passed in this last legislative session. Okay. So we've got all of these multiple access points, and so that's what I mean in terms of that being a good thing. Okay. Now, looking at those lower levels of government, you know, there were a lot of questions concerning the county commissioner's court. So honestly, I don't want to spend a lot of time on the county. And the reason is they're just arms of the state, right? They literally do whatever the state tells them to do, literally. So they do not have lawmaking capacity. We have 254 counties, that's the highest in the country. Now, that county judge and county commissioner's court, I will say this, that county judge, when you look at those three institutions, the executive, legislative, and judicial branch, that county judge is the executive at the county level, right? So they don't have any judicial function. The county commissioner's court is the legislative branch. But what they're doing is basically setting tax rates and creating a county budget and dealing with those county issues, but only based on what the state allows them to do. The structure of every single county in Texas is the same pretty much throughout, regardless of geographic size, regardless of population size. You have a very generic formal structure of that government. It is divided into 4 precincts, 4 county commissioners that sit on that county commissioner's court, and the county judge presides over that county commissioner's court. They also make a few appointments, but
So the authorities are the same and the topics are the same, they execute for the state in
they
essence.
execute whatever the state tells them to.
And again, that's all across the state
That
the
is
same, yeah.
for every county. You know, Bexar County is the 4th largest county in Texas.
In population? Yeah.
Loving County is the smallest population in Texas. Bexar County has 2.1 million residents. Loving County, my last count, 2014, 2015, there was like 85 people. It's all family, right? But it's still organized in the exact same way. 4 precinct commissioners sitting on that county commissioner's court, presided over that county judge. It's also highly fragmented, so there are a lot of elected positions. You have the sheriff. The sheriff is basically, that was another question, all they're elected in a county-wide election. Actually, everyone is elected in a county-wide election except for those, the county commissioner's court. They're elected by precinct. The sheriff is basically the chief law enforcement officer of the county. And for the sheriff in Bexar County, what you typically see in the large urban centers is that the city will claim jurisdiction for law enforcement within the city limits, but all of the unincorporated areas, that's left to the county. So for example, I live just outside of 1604. If I have an emergency, I call the county, I don't call the city. But, go ahead.
Somebody told me that flipping at this county level would make it, that it was easier to flip at the county level and it would have an impact. But what I'm hearing from you is that it wouldn't.
Sounds like you gotta move the family out if it's 85 people, I mean.
Right.
Very into it.
Well, the thing is that, so the county, I mean, they're responsible for, where it's really important is with respect to property taxes, right? Because all local governments, their primary form of revenue is the property tax. And so the county plays a huge role because, as you know, we have the appraisal district. And so in setting the property tax rate and overseeing the appraisal district, that determines how much we pay in property taxes. You know, during this last legislative session, Governor Abbott, you know, had this, you know, bill, you know, law signing ceremony where he cut property taxes for all homeowners in Texas. But it's all a sham, right? So you can go and cut property taxes, but if you have the county, which is an arm of the state, who is responsible for appraising the value of your homes, they might have a lower rate, but what are they going to do with your appraisal? They increase the value of your home, and so you still end up paying those property taxes, right? But so it's that taxation that is really problematic, and that has a lot of influence.
And that would be for the commissioners, or that?
The county judge with the 4 commissioners. There is a tax assessor and collector. They are responsible for determining, you know, how much each property owes, and then they collect it. But the tax rate itself, that is entirely determined by the commissioner's court.
So this is something that I'm connecting from a while back. Maybe you can answer a few questions of mine. When it comes to school budgets, those are largely dependent on property taxes, correct?
Correct.
Okay, so with that being the pivot, you know, in a lot of the education system, is there any possible way that that can change? And if so, who's the target to put pressure on in order to change that?
It has changed. The structure has changed over time. However, there are a lot of competing interests. And so...
In a capitalistic manner?
Yes.
Okay.
Right. And so for example, back in the 90s, the property tax structure, by the way, our state Supreme Court declared the property tax financing of our public education, they declared it unconstitutional. Back in the late 70s, early 80s, in the Edgewood case, that was my backyard. So Edgewood ISD brought up that case. And, right, because when you're looking at funding schools based on the value of homes, you know, if you're in a school district and, you know, you're collecting property taxes from all of the homes at Alamo Ranch versus, you know, you go to my neighborhood where I grew up, you know, West Side, 36 in Castroville. Those homes, you know, if my mom were to pass away, she still lives in the home that I grew up in, I think we might get $75,000 for it, you know, and so you're looking at a value of $350,000 versus $75,000, $100,000. There is a huge disparity. So that property financing was declared unconstitutional. So what the state legislature decided to do was to pool those property taxes, all property taxes for public education, and then redistribute.
Based on?
Need. So here is where interests come in. School districts with more affluent populations filed a lawsuit. Wasn't fair that they had to go and pay for the education of, you know, some poor kid in another school district. And the state Supreme Court agreed. So they said, hey, Your property, your school financing system, is it working? Try again. So 4 decades later, and it's still unresolved. It is still based predominantly on property taxes.
Isn't this session, they appointed a committee to look at that during the, so they're gonna have this special
Was that-
committee,
you mean
right?
an interim charge? Interim-
They always do this. So they
Oh,
always have
so
these
this is nothing new.
investigations. It's happened several times over.
Mm.
So that's part of that legislative council I was
Right.
referring to.
Legislative.
These are basically legislative committees that work not just during the legislative session, but between
Right.
the legislative session. And so,
Is that different
So
from the
it's
interim
just,
charges?
say that
Say
again?
we're doing something about it, right?
Is that different from the interim charges? I'm not quite sure where interim charges come in, that the presiding officers can make to their chambers, right? There's the ability, the Speaker of the House can write a list of requirements for study.
Yeah.
Are those
Yes,
executed by the
they
legislative
get to
council?
control that agenda.
Oh, okay, and that's what the legislative council does, okay.
Correct, correct,
Gotcha,
yeah.
Going back to what you said about the plan changing regarding property taxes, 2 questions. One, you said that it was redistribution based on needs, right? Okay, so number 1, how were those needs determined? And what were those needs? Was that, infrastructural integrity or anything like that within the region? And then 2, what was the length of time? Was that second plan of redistribution given enough time to be able to see results? Or was it back-to-back, Supreme Court case?
No, it was nearly, the challenge to that system was nearly immediate. The redistribution, if you look this up, it was called Robin Hood. Take money from the rich, give it to the poor. Now, how they did that, I'm not even gonna pretend like I know how they did that. But you have to remember in public education, the primary, government can only control what they can control. And so that means that there's a special emphasis on controlling the curriculum and what we as educators do in the classroom and trying to have all of these assessments to increase accountability. But study after study, and this is what I tell my students, we can't rely on the state, or even the federal government for that matter, to improve the quality of our education system. Study after study tells us it literally starts at home. When we look at students who go to impoverished schools, look at their academic success, students going to impoverished schools, and they go and apply for the lottery, right, to go and get a voucher to go to a more affluent school, a better rated school. Those students, when we take a look at those students who apply, whether they get the voucher or not, we find that both, regardless of which school they go to, both are on the same academic track of success. And why? I mean, if you're going to an affluent school district that has all of the resources, competitive teacher salaries at their disposal, versus the kid that, has an 8-foot fence surrounding the perimeter of the school and probably has teachers that aren't certified, how is it that both are on the same academic track? And that one variable is that they had a parent who played an active role. And that's actually the message I give to my students. Start with yourself, and when it's your time and you have kids, you make sure you turn off the damn television and all the computers and whatever else. You sit with them, you read. But it's parents. So there's no magic wand on education. Parents need to do their job.
So rather than procedural, it's more sociological.
there is an entire cottage industry that is going to say, hell no. You know, we have all of these tests. There is a lot of investments in testing. We have
Hell yes.
schools, huh?
Hell, yes.
Exactly.
I've done research on that.
Yeah, and so there are all of these interests. There are stakes now. And, you know, and I mean, if you take a look at what is going on in education, you know, it's no wonder that we're ranked 51st in voter turnout. We're not educating our students. You know, we're supposed to be teaching them civics, and instead we teach them to, you know, we do teach them communism bad. But other than that, we're not really teaching them how to be engaged citizens, right? Because our relationship with citizens, it's not just about, you know, what government can do for me. You know, most of us like to go and bitch and whine. You know, government needs to get off my back. You know, I need a tax cut. I need this, I need that. Well, I used to live in a country that experienced democratic breakdown, where we had a military. We had a military that believed that the government was too stupid to govern. There was a coup. And that had a tremendous impact, you know, because, you know, when I went to grad school and studied democratic breakdown and redemocratization, it's funny because there is always this Western examination. Well, how could they just sit back and watch their democracy break down? How could they just turn it over to the military? Well, how do we elect someone that has absolutely no political experience?
Not a clue.
Or interest.
Or interests.
But he's got money.
Give it to us. So how does the city fit into all of this?
All right, so the city is going to be one of those important access points that I highlighted, right? Because if you can't get it done nationally or at the state level, then you go local. And so in San Antonio, we have a council-manager system of government, okay? So when we look at the three institutions, executive, legislative, and judicial branches, I'm not going to talk about the courts because that's like, you know, a week-long session that I would need to come back for. But for the city manager is the acting executive, right? They are responsible for overseeing the administration. They implement all of the laws, ordinances passed by the city council. The city council is comprised of the council members, and we also have a mayor that gets elected. And because the mayor gets elected differently than the council members, so the council members are elected by district, okay? And that is actually a good thing. Statistically, the by-district elections at the local level produce more diverse representation, okay? So, you know, when you have at-large elections, you tend to have city councils made up of a whole bunch of white men,
Yeah.
right?
Interesting, you know, San Antonio was the last major city in the United States to give up at-large district.
Yeah.
And I think it was in the
Remember that.
mid-90s. I think it was about 95. It was not that long ago.
Right, right. But it was also in response to a lot of the studies that emerged showing that increased representation. And you have to remember, San Antonio, 75% minority right now. And so there would be, I assume, some criticism if we had an all-white male city council. So anyway, the mayor presides over the city council. They are a voting member of the city council. They have the legislative responsibility of passing laws. Then that city council goes and hires a city manager. The city manager, again, is the executive. They oversee the daily operations of the city and help implement all of the policies passed by the city. And, you know, if anyone is interested in politics, that is where you get in, because all you need is a master's degree in public administration. Scully earns, her base salary is something like $400,000, but she's got all of these other incentives to stay, like a car allowance, a clothing allowance. All of those additional incentives add up to almost $600,000. The city manager in Austin gets paid like $270,000, in Seguin $204,000. So, you know,
Is she
that's
really good at your job?
she's been at it for over a decade. That is actually not the norm for city managers. When you first get started, you gotta develop a reputation. And so most city managers will go from city to city to city. You know, you work in small areas and you work your way up. That's what she did. She started off I don't know where she started off. I know she came here from Arizona, but you know, she's been city manager for over 10 years.
Technically, she's really, really good. A lot of days that actually is a good thing. Some days it's not such a good thing.
Correct.
It just depends.
It does, right? The fight, for example, with the police union. You know, you never want to go against law enforcement on something like that. You know, same thing, you know, with Congress, with the military. You know, these are folks that are, you know, putting their lives on the line, and so to go out in opposition to them, not a smart strategy. Especially when you're giving yourself a $25,000 bonus that you're trying to say there's no money. But in terms of setting the agenda, right, the manager is supposed to be more businesslike, so neutral politically. But increasingly we're seeing them take on that executive function of creating a legislative agenda, and so we're seeing that happen within our city as well. So Scully has been incredibly influential in the ordinances that have gotten passed.
Even in the case like this change in city council has been really a fairly radical shift. And some of the initiatives taken on by the mayor and approved by the city council, it's hard to believe that they are part of her agenda.
Correct.
So,
Correct. And so that is that a fine line that the manager has to walk, right? Because the city council is elected.
So who has
And
higher
through it.
firepower over her, the city council?
Oh, the city council, they hire and fire her, right? But she's had a lot of goodwill. She has been able to work with several councils, city councils, right? And so that is part of her effectiveness. Ron Neuenberg, right, he took a hard left compared to Ivy Taylor. And so we'll see how that relationship develops over time. But at the end of the day, she's responsible for doing whatever the city council says. Now, I do want to say one really important thing, and it's bad news. I mentioned it at the start. Power flows from the top down. And so one of the things that we're seeing our legislature do is preempt local laws. We saw this in this cycle with the Uber legislation, right, the ride share, which preempted the ability of local governments to regulate ride share. We saw it in the last legislative session with Denton, right? 59% of voters voted against fracking. And the legislature turned around and said, sorry, local government, you can't do that. That is under state purview.
And that's kind of what seems to me perhaps pernicious about this idea of of the state allowing their law enforcement to come in and assist local law enforcement. Because on the one side, they've made restrictions on local authority, and here they are preempting and taking place. It could become local authority.
Correct.
That's scary to me.
It is. It is frightening because, again, remember with Strauss's retirement,
Yes.
we don't know what kind of crazy we're going to get. Are we going to get another Dan Patrick?
Right.
I mean, Dan Patrick, think Rush Limbaugh.
Right.
That's Dan Patrick. He had his own radio show, very popular in Houston. But that is his ideological, worldview. And Joe Strauss got a lot of criticism within the House. And so we'll see. This is the first time in a long time that there is a vacancy in the speakership.
And no obvious successor.
Exactly, because even Strauss's closest political allies, they've also decided to retire as well.
I just want to point out, though, that Joe Strauss threw the immigrant community under the bus
Yes.
with SB4.
Yes.
Just show me your papers. He
I did say
caved
he
on that.
was
That's what makes them a moderate.
pro-business,
I
right?
know, and that blows my mind.
Right.
That's just bizarre.
Right. So,
A Texas matter.
And what, is Lieutenant Governor up as well soon?
Mhm.
So you got
up
Lieutenant,
for re-election 2018 next
2018.
year. Yes.
So Speaker, but
It doesn't matter who runs. In Texas, we're dead last in voting. And when you look at the people who do vote, they tend to be older, more affluent, higher educations, and white.
Oh, sorry.
And they are predominantly voting Republican. And the other thing happening is that our elections, they don't coincide with presidential elections. And so in Texas, we have about 45% of voters that turn out for presidential elections. That drops to about 30% or less in those midterm elections, which is when we're voting for our executive branch, for governor and so forth.
okay, but what do you say to the people who are out there every day knocking on doors? We've got like
Keep
the top
doing it.
activists
Keep
right
going.
there.
Keep
We've got
doing
walking on Sunday and telling us
You
just
have
like
to
to
keep
give up.
going, because here's the thing, so even though the state can preempt local ordinances, most Texans, when our Constitution was ratified in 1876, only 10% of Texans lived in urban areas. Today, only 10% of Texans don't live in urban areas. And so cities have a lot of clout, and we have lobbyists, and we also have an interest group that represents the cities. And so if you're looking to get reelected, no one pays attention to silence. So you have to keep pounding the pavement. You have to keep spreading the word. And you have to spread that out. You have to be as far-reaching as possible and make sure that you know who you're going to. So it does require some research, but it's not that difficult. The information is out there and readily accessible. Yeah.
Diego Bernal mentioned that the greatest concern of all of the fellow legislators in Austin was not, their family, the laws, the rules, their health, their friends. It was getting reelected.
Mm-hmm.
And we know for a fact that many, many special interest bills have been passed because of heavy donations from
Correct.
PACs.
Correct.
Does the city have a PAC?
Yes. I don't know. Most large cities have their own lobbyist that they send off to Austin.
Does the lobbyist
But-
have a checkbook?
But most Yes, but most large cities are also members of, what is it called, the municipal,
Municipal League
the
of Cities.
Texas Municipal League,
Yes.
something like that.
Came out.
And so they represent the cities when it comes to governance. But the non-participation means that there is a power vacuum that gets filled by interest groups.
Right, all the money in the world is not gonna make up for nobody voting.
Correct, but this is where the individual comes in. Cause you go knocking on people's doors in Austin, or go to their offices, and I will guarantee you, you're getting a seat at the table, you will be heard. You will be heard. Every representative, whether at the state level or at the national level, they have staff that is there for constituents. So that's why I say that protesting is not enough. So you'll get some attention, but for action and to deliver results, you have to contact the actual decision makers. And this is knowing who represents you and focusing.
Yeah, visiting the offices, one-on-one.
Literally,
Yeah.
correct.
Well, and providing them a reason to think that if they don't do your bidding, they're not going to be reelected. Because
Correct.
that is their major concern.
Exactly, because the thing is, if people, the very fact that you have made an effort to contact, right, because most political behavior, over 80%, is based on voting. So the very fact that you have taken an alternative form of voting behavior, no representative wants to be dealing with a constituent that is unhappy.
Except Lamar
And
Smith.
especially if
Yeah.
you have a whole bunch of them.
Yeah.
Especially if you have a whole bunch of them. Okay?
Do we,
There's another question over here.
So the election right now, they seem to be mostly like Republican.
Say that again?
The election right now, the amendments seem to be mostly like Republican amendments, like the number 4. But why?
Yeah,
but why was it? I think it was sponsored by a Democrat, and so we were wondering why.
One of them, I want to say, if I am correct, was sponsored by our state senator Menendez. But
Number 4 is the one to let the Attorney General give him
45 days. That one?
45
You're talking about the amendments.
45 days.
But it seemed like somebody pointed out that was sponsored by a Democrat, so we were like,
That's strange.
okay,
Judah Suppery, yeah.
I don't know everything.
all right, so, we have, oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
We're supposed to close, they actually close at 8 and we're like quite a bit after. So I think this is an amazing conversation. I don't know about y'all, but
Thank you.
there's a lot to think about. I took a ton of notes, so I'll post those on the page. We have one more comment from Cecilia. If we have one more burning question, we can do that. But I say let's continue this conversation, if you don't mind, if we can continue this conversation
Yeah.
on the event page. And we can certainly, perhaps we'll have a live copy of tonight there as well. And if anybody can think of a way to kind of maybe take those notes and make them pretty or make them skinny or make them have a little bit more, get it drilled down to those bullet points so we can share them easily and quickly. Maybe we can even have a follow-up discussion where we think about how do we get this message out in a succinct way.
I think you should give us a test.
So we do a quiz. We can do a quiz. So this is just the beginning. So thank you very, very much.
Thank you,
If you,
Laura.
You're welcome.
if you